Right. Well, hey, everybody. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. My name's Tarek. Justin, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for asking me to do this. A power greater than myself separated me from alcohol and a host of other mind altering substances on the morning of November 5th in 2007. And because of a loving and merciful God, the program and the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and a group of men and women around me that are not afraid to call me out on my behavior and describe what they're seeing in my lives, and without worry of hurting my sensitive feelings. For those reasons, I have found it unnecessary to use alcohol or any other substance to address any degree of psychological pain that I am experiencing. And for that, I will be forever grateful and indebted to this power that I do not understand, nor do I comprehend. But I know at a very deep level, this power exists. I've seen it in the lives of others. I've seen it in my own life. And so I have been asked to talk about sponsorship, to talk about the 12th step. Um, it's funny. It depends on the day. If you ask me which step is my favorite step, I think that changes day by day. Um, but step 12 is definitely what I believe to be the jewel of our program, where steps 10 and 11 tend to be the juice of our program, in my opinion. And then steps 8 and 9 are the ultimate surrender. Um, the best description of the 12 step that I have found in our literature is actually in the forward to the first edition. You know, to show other alcoholics precisely how we recovered is the main purpose of this book, and that's what we are. We're way showers. I was talking to a sponsee earlier today, and we were talking about whether or not there's such a thing as truth. And I'm a guy who doesn't believe there's no truth. There's only our truth. And the program is outlined in our literature in the big book, and in the 12 and 12, it's a treasure map. And the treasure map leads us to a treasure, and everyone's treasure is different. And from that treasure, you receive experience, and the experience is given a meaning through our own interpretation, and therefore we discover a truth. But as a sponsor, we show the way. And I wasn't always like that. I have been through very different stages of development when it comes to being sponsored and sponsoring. My current sponsor really doesn't like labels like sponsor and teacher and mentor. We're just people walking the spiritual path. And I really like that. I I do think it's paramount to talk about being taken to the gates of insanity and almost death and being brought back to tell a story, because identification is the foundation. Until that understanding is reached, little or nothing can be accomplished through a conversation and dialogue. Um, you know, I had all the reasons for why I developed the relationship I did with alcohol and all these other substances. I thought it was because I was sexually abused from age 4 or 5 until I was about 7 by a family member. There was being abandoned by my mother. There was the physical abuse at the hands of my alcoholic father. Um, and swearing, because when you grow up in that alcoholic home and you hear the flesh on flesh in the middle of the night, and you hear the doors and the furniture breaking in the middle of the night, and you hear the curse words in the middle of the night, and these adults that are screaming, and you start to put two and two together at some point, and you realize alcohol has something to do with it. And so the young child that I was, as I developed into an adolescent and a teenager, I made a declaration that I was not going to end up like my father. I wasn't going to hit my mom. I wasn't going to, he physically, I won't call it abuse, but we got beat down when we did something wrong. That's the house we grew up in. And I wore those experiences on myself, and I used them as an excuse to justify behavior, but I also had linked them to what I thought alcoholism and addiction were. And it wasn't, and I'm 40, I'm gonna be 48 years old. And in October, and I'm almost 17 years sober, and I've been almost sober as long as I drank. I started at 14, I got sober at 31. And it took me years of being sponsored to realize the importance of letting go of old ideas and how that's connected to the spiritual awakening that we talk about in the 12 step. And one of the old ideas that I had to let go of, or a combination of ideas, was that all of those events that took place may have exacerbated my relationship with alcohol and drugs, but it was not what made me alcoholic. And so in our book, it says we had to concede to our innermost self that we are. And so then I had to get down to evidence. And the evidence was, well, once I started, I couldn't stop. And once I stopped, I didn't know when I was going to start up again. And I lost power, choice, and control. I was incarcerated. I lost a home. I had the bankruptcy. And all of those situations, they go with it. And I get dropped off in a treatment center after being incarcerated. I had to do a 90-day inpatient program. And while I was incarcerated, I began to have these experiences. I remember sitting on the edge of my cell, edge of my bed in the cell. I was in Duval County, Florida, is where I was incarcerated. And I remember being on I had gone on I was on day 5 or 6. I had not slept in 5 or 6 days. I was consuming an ungodly amount of alcohol and other substances. And I get arrested with 2 Schedule 1 drug trafficking charges. And so I'm sitting up all night. I'm going to eventually go into detox over the first 4 or 5 days that I'm there. But that first morning, as I watched the sun come up, there was a thought injected into my consciousness. And I use those words very deliberately because I wasn't sitting on the edge of the cot in the cell having a train of successive thoughts, like my intellect rationalizing this end thought, which was, oh, today is Jason's birthday. It's my new sobriety day. Because I started going to 12-step meetings in 2004. This is the morning of November 5th in 2007. And for me, at that point, to realize that there was a significant meaning with this new date, the miracle of separation, November 5th, 2007, because of the state of consciousness I was in. I'm not saying it was elevated by any stretch, but I think the events in my life and where I had gone to, where I was living out of hotels, was what the ego needed to be suspended. I don't think the ego can be destroyed, but the ego can be put into remission. It can be thinned out to such a thin layer that it doesn't dominate our experience. And in that moment, the ego had shifted to the background. What was left was this realization that gave meaning to a new sobriety date, because Jason was a dear, dear friend of mine that died of a drug overdose on my birthday in 2003. And so I took that as the universe, God, the creative intelligence, the spirit of the universe was communicating with me. He gave me a significant meaning. You know, for over the next 5 weeks, I would have these experiences, one of which was every time I left my cell to get one of my meal trays, it was dangerous for me. People were talking to me. They weren't saying nice things. I was scared to make eye contact. There was a lot of dangerous people in this pod because my charges were so severe. And I started to stay in my cell, and I wouldn't come out of my cell unless it was time for a meal. But then I noticed one day that there was a group of people, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 people would walk over to the corner of the pod in this little nook, and they would talk, and they had books. And I later, after I joined them, I realized it was Bible study. And so I just curled up in this little ball in the corner of the pod, and I would listen to them talk about things that the good people of Alcoholics Anonymous had talked about at meetings I had attended in the past. And so I was being directed back to Alcoholics Anonymous. And because the ego was in the background, it was in remission, I said, okay, to myself, okay, maybe that's talking to my higher power. I don't know. I read some books that they passed around the jail, which, and 2 of them, Exceeding Your Gratitude for Our Creator, and another one called Live Your Best Life Now, both had sections about the 12-step fellowship in the program. And so again, I'm seeing the signs. And then I'm sitting in this county jail, and I start thinking about this guy who used to be at my old home group. It was a very large meeting in Atlanta, Georgia. It was about 200 people on Friday night. It was an auditorium, and this guy used to sit on the last row, and he was always the last person they called on every Friday night. So I mean, it wasn't his group; it was a huge home group. But this guy had started this meeting. This is 2000. I mean, I started going to that meeting probably around 2005 or six. He had started that meeting in the late 80s or early 90s. And so he was one of the elders in the group, but they always called on him last. So I called him the closer, and he would later become my sponsor. Um, but I was in jail and I started thinking of this guy named Dante. And I remember he used to sit on the back row and he used to say something that sounded like this. Now, what I'm about to say, I would not say this today. I think it's too harsh. It's not the rigidity that I want to carry as a message. But what he would say is like, if you're new, welcome, but you have nothing that we want. What we want you to do is get a sponsor. We want you to sign up for one of these big book studies on the board up here in the front. We want you to write inventory, do a fifth step, start making your amends, learn how to practice a 10th and 11th step, and then show someone else how to do that. And then we want you to come back and tell us all about that experience. And I used to go outside the meeting and assassinate his character because the treatment centers I had been to told me that the meetings were my spiritual filling station. I was supposed to go to a meeting and take everything I could out of the meeting so I could get just enough relief so I could just not drink no matter what and come back the next day to another meeting. And that's how I would spend the rest of my life. I don't think they were trying to hurt me. And there's nothing wrong with making meetings. I love meetings. I went to probably 365 meetings in my first year, if not more, probably much more than that, because there were a lot of two-a-days for me. And this man is coming into my consciousness in this jail. I'm being directed back to the guy that I used to go outside and talk crap about. But for some reason, I knew if I found that guy, he would have an answer for me. Where did that come from? A power greater than itself. Eventually, they would release me into the custody of the treatment center, and I wanted to go to that Friday night meeting. So I got to the treatment center on like a Tuesday, and I remember telling them I need to go to this meeting, and they didn't want to go because it was a lengthy drive. And finally, they caved and they took us to the meeting. And we get there, we're late. The treatment center van's late getting to the meeting. It's raining on this particular Friday night, and the meeting's already started. And so they park the van, and I dash across the parking lot. There's one man in front of the church underneath the awning on his cell phone. And he happened to be a guy that had tried to sponsor me a year and a half prior. He was sponsored by that man, the closer, the guy that closed every Friday night. And I walked up to him and I said, I don't want to die living this way. Will you please show me what to do? I'll do whatever you say. And that man started meeting with me once a week. And he took me up to my 8th step. I remember taking my 3rd step in the closet, a storage closet in the treatment center basement, holding hands with a man on my hands and knees. And from the world I come from, you don't get on your hands and knees with another man in the dark. And that's how sincere. The sincerity for me was such an important ingredient. You know, our book talks about when we sincerely take such a position, all sorts of remarkable things will follow within the guidance of a sponsor. And so this man started. I was required to go to a Monday night big book workshop at my grand sponsor's house, who's the guy I was talking about. And so I was working the steps with my grand sponsor. I was working the steps one-on-one with this man that would come to the treatment center. And then as we got to making amends, I just naturally gravitated to my who then became my sponsor for the next little bit over a year, about a year and a half. This is the kind of sponsorship I grew up in. Very big book based, very step 1 and step 12 based, greatly influenced by Joe and Charlie. And so what I want to talk about, I've got a little bit of time left, is the different sponsors I've had in my 17 years here, and then maybe share some best practices about sponsorship. But one side note, so I was that court case was going on. One of the reasons I think I'm so passionate about Alcoholics Anonymous and this power that I call God is because of what happened to me. I think that's true for all of us that receive the gift. the gift of surrender. I don't think of surrender as something we do willfully. It's something that happens through us. We're surrendered. And they were trying to tell me I was going to go to prison for those 2 trafficking charges. They offered me 3 years in prison. While I was in that jail, a friend of mine, and my family had turned their backs on me. That's a whole nother talk. I had nobody left. I had torched everything, no home, nothing, everything gone at this point. I had my car and I was traveling around the country going to concerts. And so they offered me 3 years in prison, and I could do it in a work camp, 18 months with good behavior. And my friend got me an attorney who had been a police officer, become a district attorney, and now he was a defense lawyer. So it is not lost on me the grace and the mercy and the hand of God that's in that guy being my lawyer. What are the chances of that happening? And so he kept saying, let's keep continuing your case. I'll keep filing motions. You stay sober, get back into school, get a job, get your own place to live, get people to write letters for you. Every time I took a alcohol test or a drug screen, I got a copy of it. People in the program wrote letters for me. Some people I made amends to wrote letters for me. Everything I documented, I sent to my attorney. And about a year into it, I get a phone call one morning after knowing that my lawyer had a meeting with the district attorney to talk about my case. Travis, my attorney, says, Tarek, I do not understand what happened. Somebody upstairs truly loves you. They have dismissed all the charges. You don't have community service. You don't have to work with the police. You don't have any paper associated with this event. And I remember in my little studio apartment, because after I graduated the sober living program, I got an apartment right down the street from my treatment center so I could keep leading the meditation and prayer classes, and I could keep leading the big book workshop that I was doing at the treatment center. And I stood in my little studio apartment, and all I see in my mind and in my eyes was no further authentication was necessary. I didn't need any more experience. I had experienced a miracle, something I could not explain. God did for me what I could not do for myself. Now, later on, when I would go make amends to a lot of drug dealers that I owed money to, they weren't just chalking it up to the game. These were individuals that I broke bread with, that I spent time with. I knew family members in some situations. I had to make the restitution. But I couldn't tell I couldn't tell them that God did for me what I couldn't do for myself. So there was a lot of people from that life that refused to see me because they thought I worked for the police. And so standing in my studio apartment, I made a commitment to my creator that I was going to repay this debt. I'm the only one that can pay the debt. And that's what my life has been about for these last 16 years and 10 months. Repaying a debt. True mercy given to me. We talk about grace a lot. I wish we talked about mercy a little bit more. A merciful God. I did not get what I deserved. I hurt a lot of people living the way I lived for those years. And by the grace of God, we have the amends process, and I've been able to clean so much of it up. And so this man, the closer that I talked about earlier, he becomes my sponsor. And he teaches me something so important. The first official meeting we had as sponsor and sponsee, he asks me to meet him at the church at 5:30. Our meeting is an 8 p.m. meeting. So the first thing I think to myself is, why is this man asking me to meet him 2.5 hours before our home? So I go to the church because this man has what I want. He, in my eyes, exhibited excellence. And for some reason, I knew I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. I found excellence, so I was going to spend time with this man, and I was going to do what he did. So he says 5:30. I'm at the church at 5:30. Well, it turns out, I get to the church. We're standing outside. We chop it up for a little while. And he says, look, I've got another sponsee coming. There's a big book study upstairs that one of his other sponsees leads. He says, I'm going to go upstairs and sit in the big book study and help them do it. I need you to walk into the auditorium with me. I want to show you something. So he walks me into the auditorium, and there's a closet in the back of the auditorium. And he opens up these two double doors, and there are stacked and stacked and stacks of platforms with 10 chairs stacked on each platform. And he goes, look, I need you to take all of these out into the auditorium and strategically place them in different places. There's going to be a few guys here in a little while. They're going to help you finish setting up this meeting. And exactly what he said. About a half hour later, two guys show up and we put out 200 chairs in an auditorium. And we set up the front table. We set up all the literature. We put up all the poster boards. That this home group, this is how big book oriented this group was. They had a poster board for a big book study at someone's house. There were 6 or 7 people in this group who had big book studies at their homes. And so you would sign up for which one you wanted to go to, and they would arrange the transportation for you. So this is the kind of Alcoholics Anonymous that I grew up in. Just remembering how blessed I was to land where I landed. And so this man comes downstairs after the big book study ends, and he doesn't go outside and start talking to all his friends. He comes into the auditorium and he starts helping us set up this meeting. And then we had the meeting. And after the Lord's Prayer, he didn't go start talking to his friends. He helped us break down the meeting. And then everything was put up, and we were walking out of the church. And he had a key to the church, which I found interesting, that they trusted us alcoholics and addicts enough to give us a key to the church. And he goes, where are you going? I said, I'm going home. He said, no, you're not. Come with me. We're going up to Longhorn Steakhouse. We do it every Friday night after the home group. And so he took me to Longhorn. And that became my Friday night home group activity for the next 3 years. It was a 6-hour event every Friday night. That man taught me the meeting before the meeting after the meeting, and the meeting itself. It totally changed the game for me. My home group, I got to go to it. I'm out of town a good bit, but I was there last Friday night. At the 6:30 p.m. meeting, I got there at 5:15. I helped set up. I went out front and said hey to people as they arrived at the church. Or it's actually the Birmingham Recovery Center, in the church. As they arrived at BRC, I greeted them. Not all of them, just some. I didn't stand out there the whole time, but it was enough to know that this is part of the responsibility of being a home group member. And then after the meeting, we helped break down the meeting. We went outside, we hung out. I've got 2 boys at home. I've got my partner at home, and she didn't want to go to the meeting at night, so I didn't go out to eat. But even after all these years, my home group is not something that I just show up 10 minutes before the meeting starts and leave 10 minutes after. It's too important for me. There's a vast difference between a group, a home group, and a meeting. And that's what this man taught me. The other thing he taught me that I thought was very valuable in sponsorship was when I would call him for advice on something. The first question, have you prayed about it yet? And it was always, go do that. Go do that, and let's circle back. A lot of times I would get answers like, I don't know what you should do in this situation. He was okay with saying, I don't know, which I found fascinating, because I've met a lot of people who that's not their experience with their sponsors. Their sponsors want to tell them exactly what to do. They want to manage their lives. And that's probably what was done with them. And the other thing that he taught me was we were circled up for Lord's Prayer. So at the end of the meeting, they would ask all the newcomers to raise their hands. And who's looking for a sponsor? And we would circle up. So imagine like this massive circle in an auditorium with, between 150 and 200 people. And he would whisper in my ear. He said, look, as soon as this prayer is over, there's a guy over there. He raised his hand. As soon as this is over, you go over there, introduce yourself, you have a conversation with him and try to qualify him and see if he needs help. And he pushed me that direction. This is different stuff than I've seen in other places. Again, I'm just grateful that's where I landed, but this is how important being sponsored and sponsorship would be. This man is not my sponsor today, but he's one of my closest friends. I call him now, I call him grandpa. He just had his first grandchild. Back then he was just an old man, but he's not that much older than me. But when you're 30 years old, 48 looks pretty old. So now I must be the old geezer that I thought he was way back when. And we still spend time together. We're going to a retreat together in a few weeks. He's still a father figure in my life, but I gravitated somewhere else because what happened to me was I got sober. I started sponsoring other men when I was 4 months sober, and I've never looked back. And the first time I got struck with the energy of sponsorship, I remember going to this guy. I don't even remember his real name. His name was X, was what people called him. He was younger than I was. He was at a sober living program, and I was working with him. So I went over. I took my big book. I sat down and we did the blank page, and I was working with him in the preface and the forwards, and he was very he struck me as someone who got a sponsor because the program he was in required that he have a sponsor. And then it hit me. I'm sitting in his apartment at the dining room table across from this young man, and I was looking at myself, and I said to myself, oh my God, this is what I was like for those 3 years. All those men tried to sponsor me. Belligerent denial, and I had all the answers because I had not been surrendered. And that evening was one of the buy-in moments for me over these 17 years, because I said to myself, I'm willing to do whatever I have to do to never be sitting where this young man is sitting, and I've done that for all these years. And a sponsorship is one of the ways that I sacrifice my personal time, and I work, because I don't know if it's been a true statement in your world, but in my world, when Bill says we must perfect and enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice, or we're not going to survive the trials and low spots. I mean, that's for a different talk, but I've had peaks and valleys while I've been here. I've been through darker times in my 17 years than I ever went through with alcohol or doing the aimless walk at 4 a.m. in downtown Atlanta. Those were dark times. I've been through darker times on the spiritual path, and they were necessary for spiritual growth, though. I wish I had more time, but that's not the topic tonight. The topic is sponsorship, and I learned so much from that man, and I made a bunch of amends, and he gave me the tools and the skill set to sponsor people, and he modeled the program, and he modeled how to participate in the fellowship. But I discovered something about a year and a half in. I was full of fear. I was hunted by misery and depression. I was unhappy because I thought life had passed me by. I'm 30, almost 33 years old. I'm parking cars at a restaurant. I just gotten back into grad school because I'd been kicked out of a graduate program in my 20s. I'm back in graduate school. I'm back in my parents' basement because I have so much money to pay back for financial amends that I can't afford to have a place and pay back the money I owe. So I moved back into my parents' basement reluctantly. And I'm parking cars at this fancy restaurant, and I'm watching all these young men, younger than me, and they have these beautiful women on their arms, and they drive this $100,000 car. And I'm said, God, where's mine? Life has passed me by, and I began to struggle, and I needed distraction. So what did I do? I started chasing women in the program. I harmed many women in the program in those early years because so much of my behavior remained the same. Yeah, I was trying to practice the code of rigorous honesty. I was trying to practice these 12 steps as principles. But the only thing that really changed about my character in that first year and a half was my willingness to sponsor people and help others. Yeah, that was exponential growth through the roof. I still manipulated my parents into giving me money. I still held them hostage at times. I chased women in the program. I used the big book to get to women. I had a lot of amends to make in sobriety I've made because of my behavior. And so I was a year and a half sober, and I was struggling. Like I said before, full of fear, miserable, depressed, unhappy. I can't sit by myself. If I'm at home, I have the TV on, I have music playing in the background, I've got my laptop. I cannot experience solitude. And so I'm on my phone with one of you saying, hey, where are y'all going tonight? What meeting are you going to tonight? What are y'all doing for fellowship? Because I cannot stand to sit with myself. And so then um, I'm reminded of an angel that visited me once. We all have angels that come for us, I believe. When I was 9 months sober, I used to go to this clubhouse in Atlanta, and it was a young people's meeting. And there was a man at this meeting who would leave the meeting right before it ended. He would stand outside and he would have a stack of CDs. Um, and he would give away CDs. And so I'm walking out of that meeting one Thursday. It was a Thursday night meeting, I think. And he hands me two CDs. And I walk to my car and I put them in my car door in the pocket. I don't listen to them. Fast forward a year and a half, and I'm struggling the way I described a little bit earlier. All those things are happening to me. I feel like something's missing. I'm just not enjoying my sobriety or my recovery. And one night I'm driving home. I've made a mess of things with another female. Her sponsor has gotten involved. And I put in one of the CDs. And the man on the CD, he's left us now. God rest his soul. His name was Mark Houston. And he started the talk off with, I love meetings that start with meditation. Meditation gets you here right now. This is the only reality of my life, this moment right now with all of you. And it blew the roof off the top of my head. I had been going to meetings. I was a big book guy, but I'd done very little with prayer and meditation with sincerity in my first year and a half. And then I put in this other CD, and it was a guy who he has a patch over one eye. He's from Ingram, Texas. And today he's a very good friend of mine. And but on the CD, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know there was such a thing as circuit speakers at this time. I didn't know there was recorded AA talks all over the place. And so he's talking about the spiritual malady, the manifestations of conscious separation. Chuck C in his book draws the circle, a new pair of glasses, like we're outside the circle of life, consciously separated. He says that there's only one problem in life, and it includes every problem there is, conscious separation. He says there's only one solution, and it includes the solution to every problem, conscious contact. And I did not have that at a year and a half sober. And I put in that CD, and Chris is talking about the spiritual malady in sobriety. He's talking about problems in sobriety. And I started to connect the dots. So I started to ask around Atlanta, does anybody know this guy? His name is Mark H. Chris R. Anybody know him? I'm sitting at Longhorn Steakhouse after my home group. Everybody's gone. And one of my friends, he's my dearest friend in recovery. We've been on this path together for the entire time I've been here. He's sitting across the table from me. At that time, he wasn't my best friend. He became my best friend. But this night, he's sitting across the table, and he's grinning because I'm telling him the story I just told you, and he's grinning. And I was like, "What are you laughing at?" He's like, "Man, that guy you're talking about, that's my grant sponsor." I was like, "You got to be kidding me." He's like, "No." And so I got connected to that group of guys. And it revolutionized my way of living and thinking as it relates to recovery. And that would introduce me to a man named Scott. And Scott became my sponsor for the next 8 years. And this man, we used to have a saying in that sponsorship family, discipline is the horse I ride. What we do is we chop wood and we carry water. They taught me a different lingo, but they also inadvertently, without intent or malice, taught me how to draw lines in the sand, almost like I had an axe to grind. And that was not what they intended, but that's the experience I had. And as a result, I started using the big book to separate myself from other people. Because if you weren't doing it a certain way, then your way was wrong. If your experience was different from Tarek's experience, you must be lying about your experience. Or that Tarek's experience is the only experience. No, both of those, no. It's a very rigid way to look at it, but it was the next phase of development for me. I entered what I call my fire and brimstone years under the sponsorship, which was fine because God used me as an instrument to help a lot of men. I have been blessed in that regard because I have a lot of men that I've sponsored for many, many years. So I can't express this belief that that was all ineffective, but I could have been more effective. And so I'll tell you a little story that sums up my my old sponsor Scott was probably the most insightful person I've ever spent any time with. One of the most insightful. The first time I ever came to his house to do step work, he had me come over at 7:30 on a Saturday morning, and I was late. And he answers the door, and he says, "Why are you late? You're supposed to be here at 7:30." And I came up. I don't even remember what I said. He goes, "No, you're late because you have no integrity and you are a liar. You don't respect my time because we agreed at 7:30 and you committed to it and you didn't show up at 7:30, which means you're a liar." And that was hard for me to take at that time, but it was exactly where I was supposed to be and exactly what I needed. And so he taught me discipline on another level. And I'm still close to this man today. I just went out to Montana and spent a weekend with him. He has a retreat center in Montana. This man holds a very dear and special place in my heart, but we started to diverge eventually because I saw the need to be effective with more people. I saw a need for me to be gentle. I earned this nickname in Atlanta, and I can't believe I'm sharing this with you, but I earned a nickname in Atlanta from people in the recovery community, and it was the Punisher. That was my nickname, the Punisher. And yeah, I could smile about it. And yeah, I could laugh about it when someone would say it, but inside it hurt. And I knew it was something with the way I carried myself as I carried the message. And in 2017, I've had the privilege and the honor of hosting a lot of speakers over the years. My home group, we traveled twice a year. We'd invite a speaker to speak at 3 meetings and do a workshop. And so I hosted all of them. So I mean, you can imagine, so over 8 years, I hosted, I think it was more than 16 speakers. And this one weekend, my current sponsor, I was hosting him. And my ex-wife and I were having difficulties. Her drinking was escalating. I tried to have her 12 step. That blew up in my face. Um, I was running a treatment center and she was running the largest brewery in Atlanta, Georgia. So you can imagine we became the proverbial two ships passing in the night. And 6 months prior to this, I remember her being drunk one Saturday afternoon, and I didn't want to be around her and her friends. So I was in the office doing some work, and she comes in there and she says, "I wish I wasn't married to a sober guy." And so I knew my marriage, intuitively, I knew my marriage was over that day, but it would be 6 months later. And in February of 2017, my current sponsor, his name is Ralph W. from Los Angeles, California, was staying with me, and my ex-wife had a blackout episode. And we had this big ordeal happen, and this gentle giant held my hand. He was so kind. He was so soft. And he was so eloquent in how he handled the situation, how he helped me handle the situation. And my sponsor and I were already diverging. And so shortly thereafter, I called Ralph and I said, "Ralph, I need you to be my sponsor." And he's been on the path with me ever since. And that man has helped reduce the distance between my mind and my heart, which I think is the epitome of what a spiritual awakening is. So every one of those men had to be there and had to pass on what he passed on to me. Because what you see here today has all their DNAs in me. I am a product of those 3 men. And what I do with the people I sponsored is that some type of aggregate of those 3 men who have transformed my life. And most mornings, not every morning, I I like to do prayers of gratitude. I do very little supplication in my prayer life. I don't ask God for a lot of things. I just thank God for so much. And on most mornings, I thank him for Dante, I thank him for Scott, and I thank him for Ralph. Because these men carried the message to me. And all three of them demonstrated it because they let me into I got to see them act in their homes with their families. This is important stuff here. I love having sponsees come to the house so they can watch me interact with my boys. They can watch me interact with my partner and they see how I live, right? Because the most important work I do is not in Alcoholics Anonymous. The most important work I do is not in steps 10 and 11. The most important work I do is not sponsoring guys. The most important work I do is within the walls of my home. A more important demonstration lies ahead for us in our respective homes, occupations, and affairs. That's what's important. Don't show me where it is in the book. Show me where it is in your life. But I used to be the opposite of that. Show me where it is in the book. And so without these three men, you'd have a different speaker, I bet. And effectiveness. That's what it's about today, being effective, being flexible. If you talk to me, if you ask me, what word would you use? If you had to define spirituality with one word, what would it be? And for me, it would be flexibility. Flexibility. And that's what Ralph has taught. It's funny. Last week, I've started a handful of meetings in my time, and they've grown and they've done their thing. And I started one when I moved to Birmingham at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's grown into a very substantial meeting. And I did the format and all that. I had 20 something people. We got together. I shared the vision. We voted. We had group conscience. They made their changes. We opened up the meeting. I get a call from one of my sponsees that they passed a motion in the group conscience to do away with the format and make some changes. I had the same thing happen at a group I started in Atlanta, and the old Tarek raised hell about it with the people that were telling him about it. How dare they? Blah, 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 blah. Last week, when my sponsee called me, I said, that's great. I think they should change it. And my sponsee was like, man, I can't believe you just said that, because he was around for the other one. Change is like, I love that I've had guys I've sponsored for over a decade, a lot of them, and they've seen the development, the progression. Because one of the things sponsorship does in sponsoring other people is that here and there, once in a while, you get a front row seat for a transformation. And there's your evidence of the regenerative power of God. Because I don't know what's impacted me more deeply, my own changes or watching the men I sponsor change. I would have to say that it's the latter. Something happens to my spiritual condition when I'm used in that way. And it's the beautiful part of this program. Like I said at the beginning, it's the jewel of our program. And I'm so blessed right now that I have a man in my life who's not about division, but he's about inclusion in terms of our 12-step fellowship and how we can be more effective with not only newcomers, but middle management. Middle management are the members of our fellowship that are 5, 7, 8 years sober, and they're struggling, and we're forgetting about them sometimes. Maybe they don't forget about them where you're from. I don't know. But I do want to end with this. It's a little reading out of a book, and I really think it's a good metaphor for what we find in sponsorship. In many spiritual doctrines, there are references to 3 degrees of faith. In one spiritual tradition, these 3 degrees are known as the lore of certainty. So a lore is a story that's passed down from generation to generation, a lore, the lore of certainty. Another one's called the eye of certainty. So you see it, you witness it. And then the third is the truth of certainty, which is you have the experience yourself. The difference between them is illustrated by taking the element fire to represent this divine truth that we call sponsorship. The lowest degree, that of the lore of certainty, or when we hear stories about sponsorship, belongs to one whose knowledge of the fire sponsorship comes merely from hearing it described at their home groups or described at dinner when they're talking to fellow members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Like those who received from Moses no more than tidings of the burning bush. The second degree, that of the eye of certainty, belongs to one whose knowledge of sponsorship in the fire, that's our metaphor, comes from seeing the light of its flames. So you show up to your home group. At my home group, we have all these side rooms. And when you get there early, every side room has a sponsor and a sponsee doing step work in it. And so that's when you see the light of the flame. The highest degree is that of the truth of certainty, and that belongs to those whose knowledge of the fire comes from being burnt in it. The ultimate possibility is represented in the above verse by the direct experience of those who are allowed to warm themselves in the fire, in sponsorship. Now, here's the thing. The old Tarek would have told you you have to sponsor. I don't know if that's true. I think that's a very egotistical statement, because Ralph has this metaphor, and I'm going to end with this, Justin. The metaphor is, if you think about going to a theater show, you have the people that work at the box office, and then you have the people who scan the ticket, and then you have the ushers that take you to your seat. Then you've got the security that's making sure everyone's behaving themselves. And you got the people in the audience. And then you have the performers on stage. You've got the orchestra pit with all the different instruments. You've got the producers, the directors. You don't even see those, the back of the house. And then some people get to do spotlight work on the stage. You know, tonight I'm doing spotlight work, but that's what our fellowship is like. All those positions are so important. It's about being useful. I think that's the main byproduct of sponsorships. I feel useful today. My greatest liability has become an asset. But I'm a guy who likes to play in the game. Growing up, I was a standout all-county high school athlete. I never wanted to come home with a clean uniform. I wanted to come home with a dirty uniform. I want to get dirty. I want to get my hands dirty. And that's why I'm on the front lines. I want to start. So I'm like, as Ralph says, put me in the game, coach. I want to play in the game. You got to find out what your truth is through the program as outlined in the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. Like I mentioned, I have a debt to repay God. I'm the only one that can repay that debt. The greatest gift that God has ever given me is my recovery. And what I do with that recovery is my gift back to God. And I hope God is as pleased with my gift to him as I am with his gift to me. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Tarek.